Well, I want to talk today. We were languishing there in our conversation about coleslaw.
Ooh.
Pro segue. And I want to talk about languishing. Um, on April 19th, the organizational psychologist Adam Grant, who is also a great speaker, he's an author, he is the host of a terrific podcast called the Work Life Podcast, which you should definitely check out. You're just listeners, you're not allowed to like it more than our show. And he wrote an article in the New York Times on something called languishing. And it was really interesting. As soon as this came out, it zoomed around the internet. I saw this article shared more than any other in a long time. And languishing is the term that he decided to spotlight as the state of being that exists between depression and flourishing. And he talked about how, is this the state of mind that so many folks spent a great deal of 2020 in, and really the first part of 2021. And here's what he said about languishing. He said, languishing is having trouble concentrating and feeling aimless. You still have energy, but there's also a feeling of stagnation or emptiness. You're sort of just muddling through your days in a way. He says you're not mentally ill, but you're not the picture of mental health either. And the result is that you're not functioning at full capacity. And so, Alyssa, have you experienced languishing in recent months?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You were the third person that sent me that article, right? Okay, so
Okay.
it is definitely getting its rounds out there.
Yeah.
And as soon as I received it, I saw it first from a therapist friend of mine who forwarded it on. I was like, exactly this.
Mm-hmm.
This word describes and encapsulates what I have definitively felt. I'm not sure all of 2020, but absolutely in the first part of 2021. I have just felt like I should have, right, more energy, more capability, more capacity around certain things, projects, or, even, remote school. We're in the last 9 weeks, trucking along. And I feel like that should has kind of been a weight on me of like, this is what I should be feeling, right? But I don't feel that. But yet I'm not like depressed in the sense that I can't get out of bed. I still do have energy and capacity around, doing my routines and, serving the habits that serve me and all of those things. But there is a definitive drop in what I think I have the capacity to put forth into the
Yeah.
world, right?
When I read the article, it gave a vocabulary for me to what I think might be the biggest leadership challenge for 2022. I think this has the potential to be the thing that we have to work on. I think that the biggest leadership challenge for the rest of this year and into next year, because the COVID recovery is barely started and it's going to take some time. I think there's a kind of workplace PTSD that we all have to learn to figure out, and that leaders are going to really struggle to navigate a little bit. The word in the article and this idea really for me was able to capture the kind of sliding back that everyone did once we got through that initial first part of the pandemic, right? You talked about the homeschooling, you talked about the work changes. In those first few weeks, everybody turns all of their senses and attention and energy and fear and everything up to 11. And we operated that way for a while, right? And I think there was a time when we all expected that this would be kind of a short-term inconvenience. But when that proved not to be the case, operating with all of our senses turned up to 11 is not sustainable. Eventually, there are parts of you that start to shut down. And so there's a kind of sliding back of our energy, of our positive, healthy self-talk for leaders in the workplace, of the kind of rallying to come together and get through it that you see on teams sometimes. That stuff just starts to fade away. And I think what we have slid into is languishing. And I think it's important to note from the article that Adam Grant does note that this was a term originally coined by a sociologist named Corey Keyes. So, giving credit where credit is due for the idea. And I think it's important to talk about why it's so harmful, right? Because obviously if we're languishing, you at one level, you don't catch yourself if your senses are dulled, but if you are slipping into a deeper mental health crisis, when you're languishing, you're undoubtedly going to experience friction. Maybe it's at home, or maybe it's at work, or maybe it's just in between our own ears. And if nothing else, languishing, if it results in you just kind of doing the minimum and trying to get through the day, well, then we're sort of getting caught into a vicious cycle of languishing, aren't we? Because if I'm just doing the minimum and then, I'm not always staying on top of the laundry or the dishes or the work, or or the exercise and taking care of myself. And now all of a sudden I have guilt about that and worry about that. And now I've got more languishing. And so there's this kind of vicious cycle. So how else is it harmful? How else have you seen it take a toll?
Well, I feel like what you just touched on, that last bit of it, where is that, the guilt, that's a more exacting term than that should umbrella, that weight that I mentioned, right? So that's exactly what it is, that guilt, that shame, that you're not doing all that you're capable of, right? And so when you show up with that shame and guilt in the workplace, think about what that's going to do to your ability to lead, number one, and your ability to recognize it and help others, help your team through it. So I think that the first things that we're identifying here from the article that are really super important, and there's a large body of work around this on its own, is naming the emotion. Naming that has real power, because when we can say, I am languishing, that means something. That identifies how we are operating within the world. And thereby gives us the opportunity to shed some of that shame, some of the guilt that we might be feeling. And the other really imperative part of this, and in speaking with, friends and colleagues who are in the therapy field, is that this represents what, you mentioned this whole post-traumatic syndrome, right? That is the next pandemic. A mental health pandemic. That is what all of my counseling and therapist friends and colleagues are saying, is that is really what we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future, is the fallout from how we had to be, what we had to do in order to condition ourselves to survive mentally and emotionally for the past year and a half. And so being able as a leader to recognize that this isn't an end time stamp, right? And understanding that this is a long-term process, and how you, number one, have to help yourself, right? And number two, be prepared to help others through the process as well. What resources can you ready? What types of services? How can you work to destigmatize mental health, mental care, so that we can not only get ourselves out of true mental crisis, out of languishing, but get ourselves to the point of mental health as the standard of care that we give first and foremost to ourselves, and then offer to those whom we lead.
Right. And I'm so glad you brought that up, as this is not a short chat where you're going to fix it by just encouraging someone to buck up, right? And on the other side of that, though, the bosses that are listening are not in a position to be the therapist for the folks who are in their charge. And so we as leaders have to land in a kind of gray area in between where we get comfortable checking in on people beyond just, hey, how are you? And, I'm noticing that, hey, you seem out of sorts. You don't seem like yourself. Can we talk a little bit about that? I'm just want to make sure you're okay. Or is there anything I could do to support you? And what do you need? And how are you feeling today? And give me an honest answer. And we get there by role modeling that too, right? If somebody says, how are you? You can say, I'm only at about 20% today, if I'm being completely honest, but I'm going to give you all that 20%, and I'm hoping that tomorrow we can maybe double that. And being able to role model that kind of honesty and vulnerability and putting a name to it. You talked about that. That was one of the first things in this article that the author points to as a core strategy to overcome languishing. The other thing that I think leaders have to remember is that when people walk through the door and they're not at 100%, that is not a failure of their commitment. That is not a lacking of devotion to you or your workplace or the mission of the work that you do there. It's human nature. We are not all at 100% every day, all of the time. And so I think that the leaders everywhere who are working with teams everywhere are going to have a certain amount of compassion and flexibility around how they interact with people, and recognizing that there's going to kind of be these constant rise and falls for folks for a while. Non sequitur, here's the other thing that I think is really interesting. Despite the fact that we discuss in the article languishing as not being a mental illness, I do think it's interesting that all of the strategies listed in the article for overcoming languishing are the same strategies that are encouraged to try to work through depression. So you named one of them, which was naming emotions, giving voice to it, taking the energy away from it, being honest about it, getting to the root feelings that live underneath how we think we're feeling. The other things that were in the article that stood out to me were trying to get into what is called flow, right? This is a state of mind where what you're being asked to do aligns perfectly with your talent and ability and your interest. So if you see this in athletes, it's called being in the zone, right? Where you're just operating at your best. If we can periodically immerse ourselves in something that we find really intellectually stimulating, that kind of meets us exactly where we are. It's the Goldilocks alignment, right? Not too big, not too small, just right. That can help. And it is admittedly harder to get into flow when we have trouble focusing, but if we can try to pursue it, even if it is just a crossword puzzle or a fulfilling conversation, anything that we can get immersed in and lost in a little bit is helpful. There are a couple other things in the article, but you're nodding, and so I want to give you a chance.
No, you're picking up about the flow thing, and that's reminding me of what I thought to myself while reading that specific section, which was there was another component of flow in which he specifies that it needs to be uninterrupted time, right? And that's why I was like, well, that explains a whole hell of a lot, because if I'm lucky on any given day, I get a half an hour.
Right.
0.5 of an hour of truly uninterrupted time. And even then, my door to my office is open so that I can overhear what my kid is doing online school.
Yes.
So there is no wonder that without the capacity to have that truly uninterrupted time, how is the flow supposed to start?
It doesn't.
If there's no ability for it. Right.
Right.
And so then that kind of made me go, you know what? I need to give up that shame and that guilt, because there's an actual legitimate time reason why I can't get to that state right now. Not that it's not possible for me, right? But right now.
And we're seeing organizations who are recognizing that, and they're actually blocking off chunks of time in their employees' schedules and saying no meetings, no Zooms. This is, no Zoom Tuesdays or no Zoom Tuesday, Wednesday mornings, to create for them an environment where we could potentially trigger that kind of experience. Because most of us in the workplace are getting yanked from one direction to another all day long. The average leader checks their email 74 times a day. Don't quote me on that. I just read something along those lines. I'm not trying to throw out made-up stats here somewhere, but I believe I saw it recently in a Gallup
article. That seems
article.
Reasonable.
But it does, doesn't it? I'm sorry, I try not to throw out data without giving you the source, but I just read that this morning. But okay, even if it's just 24, like, hello, it's still 24.
Right.
And so getting into that flow state is only going to happen when we are willing to take the protective steps to block our time or to say no to or resist things that cause those kinds of interruptions.
Yeah. But I think that's a really great start. Those are some hard tactics that people can start to take and make for themselves. The other thing that I think as leaders, like Joe mentioned, obviously you're not their therapist and that's not your capacity, but helping people name and role modeling, I think is really important. Role modeling about your own mental health. And then the other part of that is that when it's out of your capability to handle, when someone is really truly struggling and you want to be able to provide them with more resources, make sure you have that information. If you have an EAP program, check in with your HR professionals, get that list of resources that are available and ready for your teams so that you're not stuck in the moment going, I don't know what to do. You have the resources available and ready, because this is going to keep happening.
Excellent point. Thank you for saying that. I feel like we could say that in every episode, that that no matter what's going on with your folks, you should have at the ready some comfortable language you can use to encourage people. Hey, have you ever thought about talking to somebody about this? And are you aware that these resources are at your disposal? So thank you for pointing that out. I have one other thing I want to say about flow, and it's entirely selfish. So a couple of weeks ago in one of our episodes, we talked about activating talent. And if you look at a lot of the research about talent and people getting to use their gifts at work, it's tied to the research on flow. And that when we get into that state of mind where there's perfect alignment between the challenge in front of us and our talent and our ability, we get a kind of tunnel vision and we lose ourselves in the work. And anybody listening to this who has gotten lost in a project and looked up at the clock a few minutes later to find that 2.5 hours has gone by, you've experienced flow. And so a number of years ago, I was talking about flow a little bit more in depth when doing some leadership training, and it forced me to learn how to pronounce the name of the gentleman who is sort of the granddaddy of this research. He is a Hungarian-American psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And I just wanted to break that out because I had spent a lot of time learning how to say this accomplished man's name, and I got it, and it stuck. And now I was able to use it again here in service of our podcast. So there you go.
Hooray, you. And I don't think any one bit of that story was selfish. I think it served our listeners. And by the way, it is your podcast, so you're allowed to be selfish whenever you want.
And the only reason I can remember it is because I spelled it out phonetically on my notes when I was writing a training course a few years ago as his last name, Csikszentmihalyi. Csikszentmihalyi. And I was like, okay, that's it. Because I did. I looked up the phonetic and I was like, I want to pronounce the gentleman's name correctly. So it's there. It's in there now. It's never coming out. I've got it. So if you ever need to know who the granddaddy of flow is, just ring me up and I'm going to have it, boom, right there at the ready.
Will do.